Cool. I can start my video. Hey everybody, how's it going? So sorry I wasn't able to be in the office today. I had a bunch of dry run testing to do this morning, so I wasn't able to get in. But today I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about data management. We're going to talk about new sites, updating site names, entity names, and then how you guys will actually be able to go in and maintain accounting data, allocation data, as well as the fields that are available, which we now call the COA, which I know you guys know is fairly interchangeable. So let me go ahead and share my screen. What we're going to start off with is actually, as myself, the administrator, I'm going to show you guys how we update entity names or site names or add particular pieces to sites, such as changing requisition integration threshold, setting up queue manager, all of those kind of various things that we handled at either the site or the entity level in old eVA will now all be at the site level within new eVA, which grants us even more flexibility to be able to say within one organization, maybe one site requires integration and the other doesn't. So it just kind of, we have a little more flexibility there. So I am in as my administrative user. And first, what I'm going to do is kind of walk through how we are going to browse to what's called the site table. You guys will have access to see the site table, but you won't be able to edit anything within the site table. Same thing with something that's called the ACT table, which is the entity level. You will be able to see, you'll be able to look through it and browse through it as eVA administrators, but you won't actually be able to edit or change anything in those particular areas because they're kind of locked down to configurators only, which I am lucky enough to be. So any of those changes that are going to come through are going to be requested through an AR. I think I have a template half done somewhere on some screen on one of these things on my computer. But the idea is that you'll create an AR that basically says, hey, I want to update this site to another site, or I want to turn on queue manager for this whole entity. Those kind of things is really the pieces that I'm looking for to be able to help out, and then we can kind of go from there. But let me get into the site table so we can talk a little bit about that. You'll see here that you'll get some options back. We want to focus on this one right here, the T-org site table. When we get into it, you'll be able to search for any BiSense org that existed in old eVA, and then as well as create new ones as we move forward. So the same process for asking for an edit for a site or an entity. You would do the same thing for creating a new entity, creating a new site, would all kind of fall into the AR bucket, requesting what you need, and then we'll make sure we get it all set up, preferably in UAT first, then training, and then production once we kind of get into that cycle a little bit. But you can see here we've got a decent amount of columns for those of you who are familiar with any browse page within iValue. This should look fairly similar. The main ones I want to draw your attention to is this label column. So this is the name of the site or what was the BiSense org. So let's say you guys have something that comes in and says, hey, I want to update LA91-procurement to procurement office. For me to make that change, you guys create the AR, ask what you need. I come into here and I just do this. You'll see a little check mark shows up, and that's effectively done. Now I have changed the name. I want to change it back, same kind of deal. And really it's that simple. A lot different than kind of what we have to do today, where there's all the pain of creating those BiSense org objects, and then we have to make those changes along the way. We can kind of have a little bit more control and much faster. There's no data loads. This is all in the system. Hopefully will prove to be very fun and fast paced moving forward. Everything else in here, I'm going to kind of ignore. It has country, status, Currency, we set everybody by default to US dollar. If we do ever introduce anyone again that has a separate or a different currency, this is where we could set the currency for their users to default to something else. So like VCU, I think, had one that was a real back in the day. We could just set their currency to be a real as opposed to US dollar, which is pretty convenient. The next columns, and I'm just going to kind of scroll over to give you guys the full rest of the picture. We start to figure out some workflowy type questions, as well as integration questions for each individual site. So again, instead of integration being set as active at the entity level, it is now going to be set at the site level, and you give a threshold. So each can be different, just like we had in the current eVA. Everybody will be converted with the new proper setup, so we'll be good from day one at least. But any changes to these will need to come through an AR as well. So as opposed to being able to go create a BiSense.org update where you could change the threshold, these thresholds will now need to be, at least for day one, come in as an AR to update them. So hopefully you guys are fairly familiar with kind of the integration process. You either have it or you're not, and then you set the threshold. If you're over the threshold, then it goes out for requisition integration. And then PO integration is kind of the second group here. Central receiving, honestly, was a field we added initially, and we don't really use it anymore. Because we came up with the profile to handle central receiving, we kind of nixed this whole column, honestly. So I would just kind of ignore it for now. We have to leave it because, again, we didn't want to mess with too much before go live. But receive by amount, this is for any agencies or any sites where they are not allowed to receive by amount. By default within the solution, everyone can receive by amount. But if we want to stop them from doing so, we can set this receive by amount to yes. And then in the receipt submission process, there'll be a blocking error that says, hey, you can't do this. And this is really for, again, integration reasons. There are some agencies that require this. So I don't know how often this will come up for most of you, but wanted to give you a heads up. Queue manager, this is at the end of the workflow or towards the end of the workflow in a requisition. Your site can be set up for queue manager where everything kind of moves into a bucket. Once it's in that bucket, a manager can review and assign those items to other buyers to be able to edit the requisition and work it, similar to what queue manager does today. So this is really just a yes, no, do they need queue manager? And then this last piece, which is fairly new, and we're not going to have anybody converted into here, but we've created a new node in the workflow called buyer inbox. This is going to be towards the beginning of the requisition workflow. And really what this is going to allow us to do is give agencies that want a buyer inbox review where they're going to look at a rec, make changes before it goes into the workflow. We actually can put them in the very beginning and go from there. So for anybody that's interested in this, I think there's going to be a whole different conversation for this piece within requisitioning. Again, this isn't going to be something that's going to be converted in, so this will be blank for everybody day one. But moving forward, if someone's interested in this, it's the same kind of deal. You guys create an AR, say, hey, I need everybody in this entity to have buyer inbox, or I need this one site to have buyer inbox. And you would just need to tell me what the approval profile is. So for instance, like something like buyer inbox. And that kind of tells the system who is going to be the approver for that. So that's kind of the high level overview of the site table. Again, any updates to this table have to be done by CGI in some way, shape, or form at this point. I know in the future we have talked about figuring out ways to be able to touch different things, but unfortunately we weren't able to get it all cleaned up before go live. And we wanted to keep this piece pretty secure starting out because it does control a lot of things within the system. Does anybody have any questions about the site table before I move to the entity table? Or I can kind of show you some of that. Cool. I'll take silence as everyone is asleep after eating lunch. All right, so T-org act. So this is the entity level table. So again, if you guys need a name change, you know, we had a lot of name changes that came in this last year with community colleges and other things changing their names from one to another. These type of changes will need to be done within this act table. You'll see here, just like with the BiSense.org or the site label, if we need to update Senate of Virginia to Senate of Virginia 2, you know, whatever it is, we can, all I have to do is come in here and just do space 2. And it would apply instantly, work across the board. I think data warehouse will have to pick it up on its normal cycle, which I believe in prod is every 3 hours. But other than that, it should look and feel instant, especially within the system. We have the ability for status, for validity. And again, everything else in here is not that important, except for this guy right here. So purchase order terms and conditions. For those of you who know what pre-printed text is, in today's world, it's kind of the terms and conditions that can be applied specifically for an agency that effectively overwrite the eVA standard ones. This is where we would make that update. So in the case of the House of Delegates, and sorry, we're in system test right now, so we'll see some fun data. But when they create an order in their terms and conditions, this is what will populate. If I created it in here, it would actually be the standard terms and conditions for eVA that we have today. So again, if there's any updates to the organizations, the entity name, or if there are custom purchase order terms and conditions for a specific agency, all of those will need to be handled in an AR, and CGI will have to update those for you. So that's kind of entity and site information. Anybody have any questions on that?
Hey, John, just one quick question. Your screen's a little small, but if you scroll down to the bottom, we can, the cog wheel's available, right? And we can download and export.
Yep. On any browse page within iValua, if you guys can see this grid, you can come to this cogwheel and you can export it. It will take what's in your search into account. So right now there's a lot of entities. I think we have like 1,200 or something like that. So this would have a table of 1,200. If you want to filter that down beforehand, you know, you can use some of these filters on the left or do a keyword search, such as like and then you could export. Just to kind of, hey, look, QRG. So you can see here, it exported nicely into Excel. And again, that's same thing can be applied to a site as well. So thank you, Jan. Any other questions on entities or sites before I keep on moving with approval profiles? So in addition to kind of a lot of the things, I know we have a rule specific one, I think Friday. Do we have one tomorrow? I think that's the demo for tomorrow, where we'll go over rules. I do just want to touch on one part of those rules, something called approval profiles. So you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with a lot of these names because they were copied and reused and additionally used across many, many different organizations. So what we did was, instead of having, you know, A136 buyer inbox and A194 buyer inbox, you just have buyer inbox. And if you have buyer inbox and you're in your organization, you will approve anywhere that shows up as a rule. So again, I'll get into a lot more of the kind of details of how that works tomorrow. But for today's meeting, if you run into a situation where there is not an approval profile that you want to add, or sorry, that you want to give to a rule. So like, let's say, and I'll keep harping on buyer inbox. Let's say we want to have a different profile called buyer inbox 3000. You guys won't be able to create that profile. That will have to be a request that comes in. If you want to reuse one that exists, there are 35,000, I think, in UAT. So there's probably some variation of something we can use. But I think that's another good opportunity for if it comes up and you guys need an approval profile specifically. Again, not to harp on it too much, create an AR and then someone on the CGI team can make it for you. Any questions on that before I get into the things you guys can actually do? I'm sure you're like, well, what is this meeting about? You're just telling me all the stuff I can't.
Hey, John, I'm not familiar with your meeting tomorrow.
Okay.
That you're referencing?
That might be I'm in like 3 of these. So I don't know.
Right.
I think
okay. I just want to make sure this is kind of at the end of this sequence for user management, data management side of the house. So
John, I have a question.
I have a question.
Okay. Angel, go ahead.
Question is, just want to make sure I understand this. A buyer using buyer inbox or buyer, whatever, let's use the word buyer. Buyer is currently used for queue manager, correct?
Yes.
Okay. If somebody doesn't use queue manager, but uses the word buyer for something else in their entity or in their site, can they use the word buyer, or do we need to request a profile for you to add a profile?
You can use the word buyer.
Okay.
I would just make sure that it's understood that if you ever did implement queue manager with that, buyer will now be both, right? So you'd have to, if you don't want the same people in that group, then you would need to set up buyer as your, queue manager people, and then you'd set up a different buyer, whatever it is, right? For the other one.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question, John.
Okay.
To make sure I have clarification and understanding, the approval profiles are the same as roles in current eVA?
Very close. They're not exact because it doesn't have the A194 prefix.
Right.
And we took out like create requisition, the ones that were tied to some Ariba functionality. We kind of took those out.
Okay.
But yes, in general, most of them. That's how we converted the rules over.
Thank you.
Sure. Which I didn't. Oh, I guess approval rules is on here. Yeah, I saw approval profile and then missed approval rules. So I can talk a little bit more about approval profiles when we go into rules, because that will be a little more in depth. But any questions about this, or anybody else have any burning questions before I keep moving on?
John, just to clarify, again, this is just like a name, but it really has nothing behind it, correct? Like until you create the rule with the name?
Correct.
Is that okay?
And you associate it to a user, right? So there's multiple parts. You create, think of this as a grouping of people. So there have to be people that belong to this group and then a rule that searches for this group. Okay. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So that actually ties in really well into the approval rules. So let me hop into there. And I'm going to stay in as admin. You guys will have the same access as eVA administrator. When I get to the actual data management piece, I do want to log in as a data manager specific, so you can see what it looks like for someone who's maintaining just their specific organization. But for now, I want to kind of keep it at the high level for the approval rules. So I have a feeling, and I wish I was in a room with all of you so I could see everyone not put their hands up. Who feels really comfortable with workflow and current eVA? Anybody? Everybody love workflow? Unfortunately, I know I've worked with most of you with workflow and trying to figure out stuff. The good news is this hopefully should feel a lot better than everything we had to do in the past that we created, 22 years ago to be able to work within eVA. So we consolidated a lot of information into individual rules. And what I mean by that is instead of having to update the rule token that fires and saying a specific rule type and adding the exact data format and all of those fun things you had to do with approval rules, we really trimmed it down a lot to hopefully be able to make it much easier to use and much more accessible. When you're having conversations with clients or with agencies, you can just hop right into UAT and say, hey, what do you want to try to do? And you just come in here and you create a new rule and start playing with what the goal of their business process is. Because we've had to, and I've been in, again, meetings with a lot of you where we've had to say, no, we can't do what they're asking. There will still be those, I'm sure, where we can't do some exact rule, but we can do a lot more. And not only that, we won't run out of rules. For those big ones like JMU, well, not JMU, but GMU, a lot of agencies were running out of rules. A lot of people ran out of their BICENT org $1, 2, 3 rules for those kind of more basic ones. There are no limits that way. We can have as many rules as you want. I believe the limitation we said from 1 to 99 was current eVA. So when you're doing the order that it fires in, it's still going to be that same kind of token concept. But instead, it's going to be 1 to 999. So now we can really start spreading things out if we have to, or if someone wants to get extremely specific, we can do that. Or we can keep it very simple and just make 5 rules that are for any dollar value and it fires 5 approvers. We have that flexibility moving forward. So instead of you guys just listening to me talk, let me hop into a new rule to kind of show you guys a little bit around here. And then once we're done with that, I'll come back to this browse page and we can talk about how we can navigate around there to maybe find the rules you need for a review. So you can see when we come in to create a rule, we're presented with a lot of the things I think you guys had to do with ARs in the past, where you had to say, hey, for Department of General Services, we're going to add a new rule that's going to fire at BICENT token 50, that kind of conversation. With a rule name, you guys would always have to give me like purchasing approval, and you would say it needs to fire extra, and like from different thresholds, right? So from 0 to 10,000, 10,000 to 50,000, 50,000 to max. So instead of having to do all that, it's going to be a lot simpler. You guys come in and you say, okay, I need a rule to fire for Department of General Services at order 50. So again, this is the thing that can stretch all the way to 999 now. All the converted rules are still 1 to 99 because that's what came in, but we have the flexibility to move things around. You come in and you say, I need an approver to fire for Department of General Services for any dollar amount. Now you could set this to 0, but if there is ever a negative requisition, then the rule wouldn't fire. So I always make it a habit to do, I believe it's 999 million. For those of you taking notes, because again, no one would be creating anything smaller or bigger than that realistically within the system. If it did, it'd be caught by the very first rule, which is the Shane, Yana, Lisa, I think Sherry's in there too, of, oh God, did you really mean to make a $25 billion requisition? So kind of the standard for rules that I would recommend, negative 999 to 999 million. Kind of getting back to the rule specifics, we have a lot of flexibility to say if we want a rule to fire. So we can say, I want a rule to fire for any dollar value if it's a minority owned business. I could also say, I want a rule to fire if it's anything other than a minority owned business by checking this box. So if it's anything that isn't a minority owned business, I need an approver. You can expand this by adding multiples. And again, you kind of get the either is small, isn't, or is small approval process, which we had to do with override rules and all sorts of weird combinations to get things to work in current production. Now it's as easy as saying, what is your business problem? What do you want to solve? I want to be able to approve anything that isn't a small business. This is how you would set this rule up. Fairly simple, right? So let me go ahead and keep going with the rest. So we have asset flag, which is just a piece of data in the allocation area. It's just yes, no. So it's a rule for if you pick yes or no on there. Probably not used very often, but again, it's available, so we want to make sure it's there. If it's a P card, fire a rule. If it's not a P card, fire a rule. If you chose to bypass integration, fire a rule. Any number of combinations of these. So you could say, if it's a purchase and it's not small business and they're using a P card, I want to fire a rule. Any combination of these things, and you can start to see how this can really expand to fit the business. And this is just 5 fields so far. So if I kind of keep going through here, you can see here we have some additional areas. If you want something to fire for a particular supplier, an approval for a particular supplier. If you want an approval to fire if something is state entered, self-registered, unregistered, which is our new ad hoc. We can create a rule for those now. If you want a rule based on a specific purchase category or procurement transaction type. If you pick a certain contract or a certain commodity, and commodities is multi. If you want to add 5, instead of having to add a row for every single one that you want to do, you can just click like I just did there. And it will all add in. And once this is saved, if any of those are used, the rule will fire. So instead of having to make one rule for one commodity code, now within one rule, you can manage all of those things. And then if you want to make a change, instead of having to make a change to 15 rules, you just maybe make the change to be, you only want the rule to fire up to 5,000. And then all you have to do is edit that. So you get a lot of flexibility and a lot of really cool things, even just at the top higher level. We have 2 header fields, generically named header field 1 and header field 2. There are only a few of them in prod that even have data to put in. On Hell, I think you have most of them. It's like VSP. I think VCCS had one. But the idea is if anyone needs header field information, it can be added, and I'll be talking about how we manage that data here in a little bit. But again, the idea is you have a lot of power and a lot of flexibility to be able to set these rules up correctly. I forgot to mention confirming order. Don't worry about DPS administrative requests. That should go away at some point. Even if you tried to add a rule for it, it wouldn't work. Because that has its own workflow. But if you have if you want to make confirming order specific rules, you can do that. Or, which I know we have a lot of, I want a rule for a purchase, but I don't want to approve it if it's a confirming order. then you would set up the rule like this. A confirming order comes through, it checks here and says, oh, I don't need to fire this rule. So by default in conversion and all of the data that's coming in, every rule will be purchase and confirming order. And then you can start really using the flexibility to say, oh, okay, you know, maybe they don't need this approval for a confirming order anymore. You come to the rule and you just get rid of confirming. So I know it's a lot, and I haven't even gotten into the allocations and these other tabs yet. Do you guys have any questions kind of about the basic structure of the rules and how we organized it?
John, within a field like SWAM categories, if you have both small, let's say you did 2 different commodities, it comes up if they use either one. But if you have it like small business and commodity, both have to be used, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
So if you wanted a rule to fire, if you use this commodity code for a small business, this is how it would work.
Okay.
If you wanted a rule for small business, separately a rule for commodity, then you would create 2 rules, right?
Okay. Right. Got it.
Question. If I wanted this to fire for $5,000 and above, where it says threshold from exactly, I would put then 5,000. Okay, good.
My count right. Okay. Any other questions before I keep going? I know it's a lot. It's really cool though. I've tried some crazy rules.
And John, you have to put back to Angel's question. If you want it 5,000 up, you have to do 5,000 and from, and then do that super large number into, or could you just put 5,000 from?
So because these are required fields, we have to give it some.
Oh, got it. Okay.
So
I see now. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's why I just do big number.
Right. Okay.
And I believe the rule in production is over 1 million has to be approved by Shane and them. So in theory, you could make the rule threshold 1 million, because then you know it's going to get picked up by the other, but it's just kind of good practice. All the converted rules are going to come in like this if there's a max one way or another. Any other questions on this? So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of best practices and things that I do. As I mentioned, this is just for the basic rule, right? If I want to create a rule that fires off of allocation data, you would save, click this update approval profile, and this page shows you absolutely everything your specific agency, so in this case, Department of General Services, they have these fields turned on. So if I want to add rules for these specific projects, I can do it this way. If I want to do these specific projects, and if it's small business, I can do it this way. Or I could say anything, no matter what, if it hits this project. So again, it's kind of expanding on what you can do at the header level all the way down to the allocations itself. I did kind of glaze over, and I wanted to mention this update approval profile toggle was something we added to be able to say that a rule has been updated. It will still be best practice, especially if you're setting things up in production, to set these rules up honestly in off hours, because if you create a rule, save it, it's applied instantly. It is done right away. So get everything prepped, ready in another environment, such as UAT or training, somewhere like that. And then in a early morning or late evening or either one, you can come in and make these changes. If it's a simple rule where everything's at this header, you don't have that problem. But anything done at the allocation level, you do need to have that initial save. So if you click save and your rule is set up to fire, I think I just talked myself out of that as I was doing it. We haven't set an approver yet, so never mind. This rule won't fire until we set an approver. So you'll have to click this toggle because you saved once, and you'll have to give a reason. And you could just say adding allocation. The idea here is we want to be able to track changes to it. So if I go in and change one of Angel's rules, he'll know that I did it. So I apologize. I've had a long day, and I definitely just lapsed on that one, but you should be good to just create the rules as you need to. I still think it's a good idea to do it early or late in the day when there's less use going on. But the idea would be you can, once you save, you see this allocation page. These options are going to be the options for the agency you're setting it up for, as well as the data underneath it. So you're not going to see, if you're setting up a rule for DGS, you're not going to see Virginia State Police data in here. You're not going to even see their particular allocation fields. You'll see what you're working on that you defined at the header level in this field right here. I know I kind of talked a little bit in circles there. Anybody have any questions about that before I keep going? So kind of the last piece, and this is where we get into the approval profile. So Angel, I'll use buyer as the example here. When I add an approval profile here, this is the drop down where you define the name of the group effectively that people belong to, the approval profile. So if you are looking for a specific one or one that's used in other places, or has the people who need to be able to approve this specific rule, you should just be able to start typing and find the one you need. It will be the same name, just minus the prefix, the A194. So if you have a very specific, and I know some of them are extremely specific in the way that they're written out, you should just be able to search for it and put it in here. So in this case, I'll use buyer because it's very generic and very simple. And I'll click save. So what I've done now is I've actually finalized the rule where I've added the approval profile to it, and it's set up at the entity level. So this is, I don't want to get too far deep with rules because I'm sure some people's heads are already spinning, because my head tends to spin when I talk about it. But a profile can be set up as one of two things: an entity rule, which means if you are using the approval profile and you have a rule for an entity, a rule for an entity, it will bring in the approvers who have this approval profile, who have access to this organization. So in plain speak, you need to be an A194 user who has a buyer profile to show up in this list. The power behind that is now if you want to set up a rule for VSP, this list is going to be different, right? It's going to be anybody that has buyer and VSP, not an A194 DGS. So this entity level is what allows us to be able to flex depending on which entity we're logged in as. The other option is something called EVA wide. VITA uses this rule. We have a few others, but this is for, your SCM approvers. This is the people that no matter where they are, no matter what entity they belong to, no matter what their orga is, they are the approver. That's it. And this would show up as an entity level. I can see if I have one showing. Yeah. None of these are going to be really good because we're in system tests, but like SCM approver is a good example in production because that's going to be your VITA crew. Accidentally hit escape. That's good. But that kind of gives me an opportunity to come back and talk to you guys a little bit about this browse page. So if I want to look for any rule that fires off of buyer, I can do that. If I want to limit it even further and say, okay, I want to have any rule that fires from Department of General Services that uses buyer. You can see here, I'm starting to limit my list a little bit. If I want to add any kind of order specific things, and I've ever checked this. You can see all of these have I'm guessing a 5 in the name, or they're within that 50 range. So I'm not sure how helpful this order section is, but the idea being you can really start to drive down what rules you're looking for to be able to get back to it. Because in production, we're going to have a lot of rules. A lot of things came over, because in this example, I talked about an entity specific rule, Department of General Services, right? If I want to make this exact rule, except do it at the BiSense org level, I would set my organization to be a specific site. No difference. I get the same options, but now you would need to be creating a requisition in this A194 DODGS for this rule to fire. So I put anybody want to jump out a window yet? Anybody going crazy?
So John, essentially now you can set up, using the old terminology, on the BSO level, you can set up any number of rules besides just the dollar approval rules on that site level.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's at the BSO level, but also at the organizational level, you can make that applicable to all BSOs, or like you just said, Tony, a single BSO.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And the approvers, because it's an entity, even if this is a BiSense org rule, any user within A194 that has buyer is still an approver. They don't have to belong to that site, for instance. They just need to be an A194. So I'm going to kind of let that sink in, because I know it's a lot. It is really cool functionality. If you guys get a chance to go in to UAT, probably UAT would be best, and just play with some rules, add ones, create a rec, see how it works, remove it, change it, get different things to fire. If you have a particular thing you remember from 5 years ago where we said, oh, we can't do that rule, try to make it, see if we can do it now. I think that provides a lot of good information and really, gets people excited for this new rule system. Because again, I think it is way better than what we had in the past. Kind of like Tony just said, without, I think, even realizing it. You can set up all the signer rule specific stuff we've had to do for years at the entity. Now you have the flexibility to do it at the site. Like that in and of itself is extremely powerful, because in a lot of cases, you've got one site with maybe some lower level buyers that you want a lot of rules for, and nobody else that you really care about. Everybody else are procurement professionals and you're fine. So instead of having to force everybody to go through those crazy rules, you just say, okay, you guys have to get 10 approvers, but the procurement professionals have 1, and separate it by BiSense org or by site. I think it will hopefully provide a lot of growth, really kind of test the use of this new rules engine, and hopefully be able to help a lot of agencies really get back to their business questions instead of just trying to create a rule based on what we allow with signer rules. Any questions with that?
Quick question regarding the approvers and selecting the name. Again, going back to the example of buyers, let's say that my agency does have Q Manager, and buyer is used for Q Manager, but I make the mistake of trying to do, I don't know, a sign rule for over $5,000, and I use the same role. would the system give me an error message or no?
No, because they could still be an approver, right?
Yeah. So I'm
So-
using the same role for two different things.
Mhm.
Okay.
And that's just something we'll have to be kind of aware of and cognizant. It's really buyer and buyer manager are the only ones you have to worry about from
Mhm.
that standpoint, because those are the standard ones. But the idea behind that really is you have the flexibility to pick anything.
Yeah, makes sense.
So if, you know, in VCCS's example, if their whole buyer group are all their shared service buyers, and you want to implement a rule where they're the approver, you just pick buyer. You don't have to associate them to a new approval profile because they're already in the group you need them to be in, right?
Yeah. I'm just asking the question to see, you know, when something would fire in form of an error or whatever. And if I wanted to create a different name, I would obviously go to where you were before and add that whatever it was, profile or whatever, correct?
You need an AR, but yeah.
Yeah, an AR for that. Oh, okay.
Yep.
So I'm going to make this up. Let's say that an agency wants to have a buyer group divided by commodities. I could have commodity buyer, commodity group 1, commodity group 3, 4. I have to ask you to get an AR for that.
Yep.
And then I just deal with everything else here. Okay.
Yep. And again, I'm in system tests, so I think there's only like 24 approval profiles.
Mhm.
There's like 33,000. So if any other agency did commodity code 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
You could use those.
they can use them because
Okay.
they'll be entity specific. So now we allow kind of that reuse where it's not going to show those other guys this particular data, but it will allow us to reuse those names instead of having to make a brand new one every time. So I would hope we can use these, and when you add it, you can save and say, okay, this list of users looks correct for who I'm expecting, or it would be blank, and then you'd have to go add the users after.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Any other questions? All right, so this is really it for rules specifically. Yana, was there anything else you wanted me to go over before I get into kind of the data management side of the house?
I think that's good, John. That was really good at walkthrough and examples. So I think we're good here.
Cool. All right, so I'll take you guys back to the handy dandy manage dropdown. I'm going to do a brief overview of data management from this perspective, and then I'm going to log in as actually a data management user for a particular set of organizations and show you the differences for how they will view the world, so that you get a good kind of glimpse of both. So as I mentioned, we have these two header fields, header field 1, header field 2. These are kind of the flow over fields, if you will, if there were any particular header fields that needed to be brought over. If I come in as a eVA administrator, I'll be able to unlimit the organization, and I can do like Virginia State Police. Actually, it wasn't actually added in here, so you won't see it. These are the 6 that exist within system test. But in theory, you could look at a different organization. So like, let's do College William and Mary, which you can see here should have 1. So if you want to review a particular header piece for them, you could do it this way. If you want to add something new, and this will be fairly standard across all of the allocations as well, you'll come in, you add a code. I think the best practice is still to add the prefix, and then whatever the value or the label is. So like in this case, I'll just do test because we're in the test organization. Do College of William and Mary. So I added code, organization. I gave it a label of test and a value of test. I'll just call this value test label so that we can see the difference. And really, when you're creating a new piece of data, that's it. You fill in the code. It won't allow you to fill in something that exists before. So if you get, there's nothing stopping you from typing something like this. But if you have happened to type that before, it will yell at you. Again, I would recommend staying within here. And I think the QRGs are saying the same thing, to try to focus, keep the same structure that we have. I think in the future, as we move forward, we'll look to standardize this again automatically. But as of right now, we do have the flexibility to kind of put anything in this field. So I would say stick to the prefix and then the value, or some shortened version of the value. And then once
John,
you do
John, sorry to interrupt you, but I just had one question. If you could really just kind of do a crosswalk of what is showing on kind of the requisition. So for example, is that code, will that show on the requisition, or is the label or the value?
Let's see. What's their code 204? So president office, add here. So you'll see test value / test label is what shows.
Okay. Thank you.
And that's going to be standard again in header field 1, 2, and all of the allocations should all be that same. So again, once we've added it, it shows up in your list. It has now been added. If you, for any reason, need to get rid of it, you would come in and set the status here to deleted, save and close. You can see it moved to deleted status. We have the ability to look at things that are only valid as part of these searches, or things that have all been deleted. And it should be real time after a save. So if I come in, of course, there's no addresses. Let me try this. A204. Go back to A204. Yeah. It doesn't have a ship to in system test for me to be able to add it, but in theory, this would all be here. And you can kind of do this in practice as well, as being able to go verify that it is there after the initial save. So if I create a new requisition, just to be sure. You can see here that one that I added and then made deleted no longer shows up here. So it's a very simple example that will then explain all of the various options you can do across the board. So that's really header field 1 and header field 2. I'm going to talk a little bit about the chart of accounts data, because this is a pretty important piece. Again, as an administrator, I have access to every entity's chart of account. This is the closest thing I can explain to field setup. So in today's eVA, you go to data management and you're setting up fields. You're really saying what fields need to be turned on and then what fields are required. As a baseline standard, every organization has to have organization and it has to be required. Everything else, for the most part, is optional. Fiscal year, from a conversion standpoint, I think we set to required. And I know there are some agencies that don't like that it's required and will have to come in. And that may be an edit that we do first thing, is make it no longer required for those guys. And as an example, to do that, again, manage, go to COA, find the entity that you want to update, uncheck required, and you're done. And that's instant. There is no pause, there's no delay, there's no overnight cycle. Anybody that belongs to either of these two sites, which is the two sites inside of this entity, L660, now we'll be able to create a requisition without giving it a fiscal year. If someone comes to you and they say, okay, I want to add an accounting field, such as cardinal account. Same process. You come right to this area and you say, okay, I want to make cardinal account an option for them to be able to populate, and I want to make it required. Now, I will caution, if you do it in the order that I just showed you and you make a new field for a new agency required, there's not going to be any data for them to choose. This is instant. So as soon as I do this, the next requisition they create is going to hit this check, and they're going to say, wait, where's my cardinal account? So as a best practice and just a general kind of rule that I follow, I look at the field that I'm going to turn on. I'm going to turn it on and make it optional so that it doesn't have to be filled in. So now anytime I do that, it's there, I can see it, and then I go add the field data, which is going to be the next step. Once I've added the field data, I can come back to here and I can make it required if that's what the if that's what the agency needs. But it's kind of we had to do so much and wait overnight, and it was such a pain because we had to wait overnight, but it allowed us to do a full day of setup and not have to worry about, little bugaboos like this, where now we have to actually look at it and think, okay, if I make this required, I need to either add data really fast or get it all set up beforehand before I even turn it on, which is an option as well. So I'll go ahead and remove that for this guy, and I'll make it required again, just so it's kind of back to the way it was. But this same concept can be applied for, again, any entity that we have within the system. So let me go to general services. So if I look at the allocations that are available for Department of General Services, you can see this is what they have turned on. If they need something new turned on, you can see all their sites. If they need something new turned on, a new field added, all you have to do is come here, pick one. You can go to see all, check box next to it. You can come in here, start typing any variation of those things. And as soon as you add it, you can save, and that will give you the flexibility to set whether it's required or not. So you can see cardinal account I just added. So I can make it required by doing that. So this is, as I mentioned, kind of the basic field page, if you will, or the closest thing to the field page that we had in current eVA. But it gives us a little more flexibility. It's instant. We can come in, pick and choose things as we need to, and get them set up. And we always have the ability here to verify all the sites within the entity. If we're trying to debug an issue and we're trying to figure out why someone in A194 VA War Memorial doesn't see activity, we can come here and say, oh, well, they should. So it's got to be some other thing, right? So it's a way we can debug some things. Any questions about chart of accounts before I get into the data management of the field data itself? Okay. So I'm going to go back to my handy dandy manage dropdown. If you guys are doing a lot of this stuff, this will be a very familiar dropdown. We're going to go to what's called maintain COA elements. Now, as eVA administrator and administrator, which is CGI, you will see every field available. Now, this is ease of use. You guys have to maintain different agencies. There's a lot of good pieces to allowing this to be open for everybody. When we look at our user that is a data manager user, when they come to this page, they will only see what has been turned on. And when they open up a particular area, you will only see what's limited to your organizations. So if you have access to see only DGS, you'll only be able to see this piece of data. Now, as an administrator, eVA administrator, all you guys have to do to see more is uncheck this box. Now you get every cardinal account number across the entire system. I'll start with this piece because this is always, if you want to see it in an Excel file, go to the grid, do the download. I'd highly recommend, you're going to get a lot of duplicates if you're not at least looking at a specific organization. So like Office of the Attorney General, on this left-hand side, you can put this, it's going to show two. Generally speaking, it's always the top one. If you want to be 100% sure, come into this see all search, and you always want to do the entity. We know a few cases where sub-entity is showing. We're tracking a bunch of those different areas, and we're going to hopefully get rid of them at some point. But if you click on sub-entity for Office of the Attorney General, you're not going to have any data because there's everything stored at the entity level. So if you're trying to manage someone's cardinal account value or make a label update and you click the wrong org, you're not going to find it. You're going to have to pick the right one. So I would say always come to the see all, type in your keyword, and make sure it says entity right here, because this is where all the data is stored at the entity level. Do that. I'll click search. So again, this is all of the Office of the Attorney General's cardinal accounts. Don't ask me why I know this, but I feel like it's like 333 of these. If I need to export them to be able to look at the list, oh no, it's 3,000 of these. So they have 3,000 different ones of these. So this is a good segue to talk a little bit about ETLs. So you guys have bulk load functionality today. We have a similar type of functionality within the new solution that's called Etls. We are working on having something to be able to give out to the field, to be able to make updates in a bulk fashion. If you need to add, 5 new cardinal accounts to every agency, going in and doing it manually is going to be a pain, right? So I would say if any of those scenarios come up, you're going to hear me say this a lot, I'd recommend making an AR and saying, hey, can I have help making an ETL or running an ETL to add these 5 cardinal accounts for these 200 agencies? So at some point, and I don't know exactly when we're going to have it available for you guys, but at some point you'll be able to do it yourself where you can load it all. As of right now, for day 1, we're limiting Etl use because it is very powerful, and we don't want to have any kind of bugs or any issues with it before we release it. So for now, you'll kind of be only able to come in, update particular ones this way. The good news, if for some reason, I'll do a test here. If I do motor tax, and I want to look at all the areas that say motor tax, because it's cardinal, right? The values are going to be similar in some cases. You can play with things like this and go in and make the updates by using the browse, which hopefully will save you some time rather than having to go to every agency and making the manual updates. But again, I would lean on, if there is a request from an agency where you have to deal with, I don't know, more than 30 pieces of data, create an AR and we'll see what we can do to help, because we can effectively run it as CGI. We just would need to get the data from you guys first, format it, make sure it's clean, all that kind of stuff, and load it as we can, right? If we get 100 requests in a day, it's going to be kind of hard to keep up. So as much as you can do manually, I'd recommend doing it that way. But if you do run into any issues or any big data pieces where you need to add a lot of data, don't kill yourself manually adding one at a time. Just create an AR and we'll see what we can do to help. So I'm gonna actually real quick before I keep going on this, I'm gonna log in as a data administrator. I'm gonna hover over their organization so you can see they have 105 different organizations, which is a decent amount. But I'm gonna show you the world of data administration from their standpoint. So when I come in as their user and I go to manage, let me close these out. Manage. I'm going to go to the chart of account data first. So if you remember, as my administrator and also eVA administrator, you can come in and I could pick any entity, right? Now, when I come in, I can only see 6 because that's what my Orga perimeter was set for this user, was to only see these 6 entities. So I can maintain the 6 that I can see. If at any point, you know, Angel wants to remove Commonwealth Competition Commission from me, he would go in to user management, remove that Orga perimeter from my user, and now I would no longer be able to edit this. Additionally, I wouldn't be able to edit any of their header field 1, header field 2, maintain COA elements. If you have an example where you want to be able to maintain more than what you have, it's the same idea, right? You go in and you add Orga perimeters to specific users that need that kind of extended access. So a couple things you'll notice on here, I can't hit an X on this limit to my organizations. I can't uncheck this checkbox. This is what really drives locking down the organizations to your specific data and really allows, you know, the GMUs, the VCCSs, if they want to maintain their own stuff and they don't want to worry about having to kick everything up to an AE or to someone else within the eVA group to help them, they can manage it all themselves. You give them this access, you probably show them this video or give them some QRGs, give them a little training session and say, have fun, good luck. And it kind of really opens up the door for them for being able to be a self-sufficient kind of entity, which is pretty powerful. So additionally, as I mentioned, this page is going to look different. So with my specific user, I'll show you guys just to make it simple. You see all these allocation levels? All of these that I have available as my user to be able to edit within these organizations. When I come to maintain, I will only see those fields on here. So let's say I'm a data administrator and the only thing I have is fund for my organization, and I have no other organization access. When I come to this page, I will only see fund. I'm not going to see all these different options. So again, without having to give everybody everything, you still kind of get that flexibility, and it really limits having way too much stuff on the screen for those that don't need it, while giving the flexibility for those that need all of these different fields to be able to edit them. So again, you'll see a few things that are different, right? Limit to my organization, can't uncheck it. I can only look at things within my organizations. I can still search for other organizations, but they're going to be within my particular Orga scope. So if I want to look at Department of Elections data, I could do that, but I couldn't, you know, search for VCCS, for instance, right? Or VSP. Those aren't in my scope as a user to see. So it gives people the ability to, you know, again, I hate always using the same people, but DOC and VCCS are great examples of this. They have a lot of different organizations in their purview. So we give them full organization parameters for all of their community colleges. And they can come in and pick their community college and say, I want to look at Northern Virginia community colleges fund, right? And they can go in and make a change to the fund. And it's all self-service. It's all them doing it. There's nothing that needs to be done from the AE side. There's nothing that needs to be done on the CGI side. They can come in and add fields, update labels, deactivate data as needed. So hopefully you guys can kind of see the power in that. I know it's an old type of solution for that self-service model, but the fact that it's instant, you know, it'll be new UI, it'll all be within one page. You're still only moving within kind of this area. You don't have to go back to portal and then go into data management and wait for an overnight cycle before you do anything. It's all instant. It's all right here. It's kind of just at the tip of your fingertips. So hopefully we'll find that that's extremely helpful. And a lot of agencies will clamor for this kind of access to maintain it themselves instead of kicking it up to you guys to maintain for them, hopefully. So that's really it when it comes to kind of the accounting data and COA elements. Let me look at my handy dandy schedule over here. I talked a little bit about ETLs. I'll kind of hit on it again. We're going to have a different ETL specific meeting when it's fully released. Again, my recommendation for you guys is if you look at a request or something comes in from an agency and you're saying, man, I don't want to do this 100 times, create an AR, request some help, and we'll see what we can do. Because in a lot of cases, we can give you an Excel sheet. You fill it out just like you do a bulk load. We just make sure it's done correctly when it's loaded into the system and handle any exceptions that way, instead of having to build that whole process. You know, it will be something that is going to feel just like bulk load in the future, except it'll be instant for everything instead of just a few areas that we have in data management. So,
John, can you touch on the addresses?
See, that was right under approval rules. I feel like I'm going blind now. Thank you. Addresses. Let's look at addresses as a data management user. So I'm going to get rid of my organization. So again, in this manage dropdown, as a data management user, I am limited to my organizational scope. Same thing we talked about with everything else. As an eVA administrator, you guys do not have those guardrails. You can look at any address from anywhere to be able to make changes. You can delete, wouldn't recommend it, but you can delete. But if you need to come in and make an update to a particular address, you'll see here if an address has been used, I don't believe it even lets you delete it. It'll pop up and say, hey, you can't do this because it's being used. You would just have to set the status to be deleted. And that's kind of the logical deletion versus hard deletion for those of you who might be a little more techie. If it's used somewhere, we can't just get rid of it. It's reference data. It needs to be able to stay with a transaction as it gets pumped out to data warehouse and everything like that. We can't just, you know, start deleting things if they're being used. So status is really going to be what drives that. But for a particular address, hopefully most of these fields will look very similar. You know, we got a phone number, an email, what type of address it is, if it's billed to or shipped to, an agency address ID, which is just this is what we imported for conversion IDs to be able to track what came over from current eVA. ERP address ID is a very small use case for those who may or may not work with an agency that integrates, whether it's order, import, export. If we have a different ID that they are using, So let's say VDOT's importing an address and they call it address 1. If I want that to be associated to an address within eVA, I could come in here and type address 1. And that way it would know what to look for when it's building the rec and the order on an order import. We have main address. It is a nice piece of functionality for anybody who doesn't have a default address set. Main address will effectively be the default. In general, as you guys probably remember from, I think it was last week's user management review, I talked about setting users default ship to and build to. Main address will not override the user specific ones. So if we're setting everybody up that way, this is kind of not really needed anymore, but it is base iValue functionality. So we left it if that is something that agencies are interested in to be able to turn on. So it's just it would be like maybe a locality. They only have one build to, one ship to. You can just set it to the main address and any user would get that as their default when they create a requisition, something like that. So little piece of added information, but probably not too life altering for most of you. We get into our fun little Google image here. This is going to be the type ahead Google search. So if I do 8 Main Street, Richmond, if I do that, you'll see here just by clicking on that search, I get a nice little picture. If I need to add any additional information, the rest of it kind of populates. Obviously, this is great if you have an address that is already, well, it's not that it's there. If Google can find the address, then it'll auto-populate for you. But if there's any reason you need to manually change anything, you know, those of you who are familiar with Richmond, you know, a lot of close parts of Henrico, people put Richmond as their address and vice versa. You know, you have that flexibility as well. It's just there to help expedite the process so you can come in, create an address, find what you need, and apply it. And then we have just a basic tracking if anyone has made updates to it, when it was, and who did it. So again, as an administrator, when you come in, you'll be able to look at any address for any organization within the system. So the first thing I would always do is come to the organization and pick the one that you want to work on first. So Department of General Services, if I want to focus on that one first, come here. You can see here Balaji's been making some stuff for order import. But you have that ability to quickly go look at the Department of General Service specific address information without having to, you know, try to parse through a bunch of lines. And last but not least, you can download it to a grid. You hear me say that a lot because it's really convenient in a lot of ways when you need to look at a bunch of data. That's it. I'll show you guys just the create address because I did just edit one, but if you want to see what it looks like when you're creating it. So if I'm creating an address, come in here. You pick your organization, fill out this information. And again, the type ahead is still going to be there to be able to kind of expedite that process. So, any questions about addresses? Just take a quick note. Is anybody still awake?
We're here, John. It's been really good. You have a good pace and you explain everything really well. So really appreciate this, this walkthrough of what's under kind of, if you will, it's no longer really a data management application or a specific tab, but it's kind of like data management program. And the two different tabs that we access data through. So thank you so much, John. I really appreciate your time today.
Sure, no problem.
Does anybody have any questions? This is your time to pick John's brain. We've got we have a few minutes left, a little bit more than a few, but if anybody has any questions, again, this recording will be available for folks to play back and to also share with your teammates if they were not able to attend. So we will be have this recording for eternity to refer to.
Hey,
so,
John.
Mm-hmm.
The two header fields, the header field 1, header field 2, they can't be made required fields, can they?
No, not as.
Okay,
no.
I didn't think so. I didn't see it there. Okay, thanks.
All right. Any other questions? Anyone? All right. Benita, you can stop recording.